The title of this video sounds very clickbaity, but I promise you it's not. This is actually the hardest visual effects shot I've ever done in Blender. So there we go, that's the shot. I hope you think it looks cool. I spent quite a lot of time on this around the end of last year. I think it was sort of September or October. And this wasn't for anything on my YouTube channel. This was actually for a project that came to me through work. If you don't know, I work as a visual effects artist for a company called The Mill, and my official job role is a nuke compositor, so I'm a 2D artist. But as you might know if you watch some of my videos, I also do lots of Blender stuff in my free time, and occasionally it sneaks into some of my professional work. And this was one of those times. So this job came in, and I think we didn't really have anyone that was available in 3D. At the time we were quite busy. And so instead of turning the job away, I think my name came up as someone that kind of dabbles in 3D in my spare time and might be quite a good candidate for this. I had a few calls with the director and the producer, and they sort of discussed what they wanted, but it was a bit of a blank canvas, to be honest. They gave me a rough idea and then said sort of do what you think will look cool and just work some magic on it. And so the brief that I was given was basically just they wanted to see a guy firing a sniper rifle, and then the bullet goes across the buildings and into the opposite window. I think originally what they wanted was something a lot less complicated than this, and being me, I went a bit over ambitious. As you'll see in the nuke setup in a bit when I show it, there's a load of drone photography of the background that I used to stitch like a panorama together. And then they also had some footage and some stills of a guy actually in a costume like this holding a sniper rifle. And initially I think the idea was to do it as a bit of a hack and maybe just steal the live action guy from one of the other shots, roto him out and then put him on a rooftop and kind of do like a bit of a 3D camera move with some projections. And it would be quite fast and the motion blur would hide lots of the errors and it would just be kind of like a throwaway shot. I thought about the best way to do it in the time and everything for a bit, and the little voice in my head that loves Blender was just saying build the whole thing in 3D and then you're not constrained to any of the footage or anything. You can animate it how you want and I'll have complete control over the camera move because it's actually built in 3D space. And so that's the route I ended up going down. So as you can see, I built the rooftop here, I built the guy in 3D, and I also built the building over here opposite. And this is the final result. So as you can see, he fires the bullet in slow motion, the shell flies out the gun, and then the camera kind of moves with the bullet, follows it as it's going past the railings, and then through the railings and follows it as the bullet goes through the window and into the building opposite. The scenery is pretty self-explanatory. The opposite building is actually a projection. So this is, I think, either a still that someone took on the rooftop or some of the drone photography. So this bottom bit is actually a still of the opposite building, and then I built a little rooftop for it and just put some textures and stuff on it. And then this dude I made all in 3D, just with doing some sculpting and stuff. I used a really basic 3D model of a person that I can bring in very quickly. So it's this, and then I basically took him and used the inflate brush and stuff to get rid of all of his muscles and make him a bit flabby. And then I used the cloth brush on him in sculpt mode to just kind of sculpt a load of creases into it, and basically made this kind of one piece, like what they call boiler suit or something. Same sort of thing for the head. I just made this balaclava by cutting out a little bit of an eye hole, using the cloth brush on it to sculpt some creases, and then found some textures and stuff to make it work. The texturing's a little bit rough, but because it's so dark in actual rendered mode, you don't really notice it, and it's just to add a little bit of texture onto the materials. And then a little bit of an Easter egg. I took a load of photos of my hands and took a photo of my face just using my phone. And projected them onto the 3D model. As you can see, it looks pretty rough, but it just adds a little bit of texture. It's quite dark, like I said, so you don't really see much of the detail. But I just figured that if I used actual photo textures, like the detail in like the creases in your skin on your knuckles and stuff, and obviously my eyes and my eyebrows, it would be a lot easier just to use a texture for that than to bother modeling it, especially because it's so dark. So that was my approach with that. The gun is just a 3D model that I downloaded online, and then I modeled the shell casing and the bullets. That's super simple. The muzzle flash was done in Houdini. I didn't make that. That was done by a guy called Richard Green at work, who is one of the runners, and he sort of volunteered to help out on this as well. So Richard, if you ever see this, thank you very much. Originally I did it in 2D with some elements, and I also tried to do a smoke sim in Blender, and it just wasn't really working. It didn't have that kind of slow motion vibe to it that we were going for. And FX work really isn't my thing. I do a little bit of sparks and stuff here and there, but proper like pyro sims I'm really not that good at. So we figured let's get someone in that actually knows what they're doing and do it properly. So that was rendered out of Houdini, and I just comped that on in Nuke, which I'll show in a bit. But apart from that, the rest of it is coming from Blender. So as you can see, he fires. I've got a light in here that lights up the inside of the barrel, so as he's shooting it illuminates the inside, which looks really cool. And then obviously the fire and stuff goes on top in comp. So that's pretty much all of the Blender stuff. It took a while to make the guy and get all the animation right. We went through quite a lot of versions of the camera move and the animation and stuff, and added a few things like this railing in the foreground later on. And then eventually we settled on this, and then I rendered everything out and took it into Nuke. The next part is just a voiceover, because I recorded this on my work machine and I couldn't record audio at the same time. But this is a look at the Nuke script. It's quite a big script and it was really heavy, so if you like lots of nodes in Nuke, this will get you excited. This isn't the final Muzzle Flash because the job was done a while ago. The job was archived, and when I unarchived it from our servers at work, I didn't have the latest comp for some reason with the Houdini render, so just ignore that. This is a previous version with some 2D stuff that I made. But other than that, let's dive in and take a look at the script. So starting with the background, as you saw from the breakdown at the beginning, it's basically made up of a couple of drone photographs. This was shot near the Thames in London, and basically what they did on set is they flew the drone up and just took a load of photos, sort of panning the drone to get a nice panoramic view of the Thames. The angles of the photos didn't quite cover the 180-degree field of view that I needed to do the camera move in 3D, so I ended up painting up a much bigger panorama that I made about twice as wide as the photos to extend it outwards. So I took the two original photos and then mirrored them and placed them all next to each other on a really wide canvas, and then once they were laid out, I started clone painting out all of the details that you could see repeated. I did a combination of a few things like taking some areas of the frame and moving buildings over the top of each other. Some bits I just clone painted out, and basically all I'm trying to do is remove things that are very obviously repeating. Then once that was set up, I wanted to make it much darker to feel more like a nighttime scene. This was already shot as the sun was going down, so it was getting quite late, so it's nice that there wasn't sort of direct sunlight in the shot, but the sky was much darker than we wanted for the actual final result. I started off by dropping the exposure quite heavily to get that much darker look, and then a really good day for night trick is doing a luma key on all of the lights in the shot. In a compositing software, when you grade something down, it just sort of gets uniformly darker, whereas if you turn down the exposure in the camera, the light would still stay fairly bright and the sky and the buildings would just get darker. So what I did here is luma keyed all of the lights in the scene and then put them back on top of the darker version of the plate. It adds some nice contrast back into the plate because you have the different levels of light and dark, and also when you defocus it, these create some really nice bokeh. Once that was done, I placed this really wide panorama on some geometry in 3D space and curved it so that it would cover the field of view of the camera. I brought in the camera that I already animated in Blender as an alembic, so I can use that exact same camera in 3D space in Nuke. And then I used a scanline render node to render that through the camera's perspective, and I used a node called PG Bokeh, which is kind of similar to a Z defocus in Nuke. It's one of the tools we have at work, and although it's quite a bit heavier, it makes the defocused image look a lot nicer. And I used a lens kernel on this, which is just changing the way the bokeh appears based on an image. So you can get some quite interesting results as opposed to just really uniform circles. In the scanline render, I cranked up the motion blur, so as the camera whips around, you get the light streaking across the screen. Because the panorama I made was made up of two photos, both looking out at the Thames, when it's on the curved geometry, it actually kind of bends the river right round behind the building, whereas it should be looking sort of into more of a built-up area. So I took another photo they took on set from the rooftop of some other buildings, and I painted it up and extended it slightly so that it fit the purpose that I was using it for. And then I put this on a card in 3D space and also rendered it through the Blender camera that I brought into Nuke. This building was a little bit tricky because the actual texture of the windows and stuff comes from a photo that was taken on set, whereas the top part that I made in Blender is CG. So I used cryptomats quite a lot to isolate all of the different parts of the building and did some individual grading on them to make them feel a bit closer together. And then once that's all balanced and looking close together, it gets a healthy amount of motion blur and defocus to tie it all together. Next up is the comp of the guy holding the sniper rifle. This was quite fiddly. I went back and forth with lots of keyframing to make the flash brighter and darker, and then darkening various parts of his body. I did quite a bit of color correction to make him feel more bedded into the colors of the actual drone photography in the background and matching the live action references that I had. Again, I made lots of use of the cryptomats, isolating bits of the gun and the skin and the balaclava and stuff and grading them all individually to make it feel more balanced. I also isolated the glossy or specular passes, which is kind of the reflection of the muzzle flash, and I did a few passes of animating it to get brighter and darker to exaggerate the flash more. And then again, I used the PG Bokeh node on this to add a lot of depth of field. The depth of field on him in this shot really helps to hide some of the shortcomings of my 3D ability in Blender. If the render of him was crystal clear and in focus, it would probably look a little bit dodgy because I didn't make it to like a photorealistic standard, but I knew it was going to be quite heavily defocused, so I kind of made it with that in mind, so I wasn't doing any work that was unnecessary. So I slapped quite a heavy defocus on this using the depth pass from Blender so that I was able to kind of put the focal point right on the end of the barrel of the gun. And then again, using the depth pass from Blender, I was actually able to animate the focal point to move with the bullet. So as the shot goes on, the focus kind of pulls away from him, moves more to sort of closer to the camera with the bullet. And then as it passes the camera and moves towards the window, the focus also kind of goes with the bullet and the background building becomes more in focus. Like I said earlier, this isn't the final version of the muzzle flash. Sorry I couldn't show that. I'm not really sure what happened to that version of the script, but I comped it in a very similar way. So basically it's just a fire element and some smoke. The fire has a couple of levels of glow on it and makes it nice and bloomy. And then I'm also using some animated noise to displace the footage, kind of like the turbulent displace effect in After Effects. That kind of creates a little shockwave sort of heat distortion-y thing coming out the end of the gun as it fires. And then the cherry on top is adding a nice big lens flare that's coming from the fire in the bottom corner of the shot. At the bottom of the script, I put a bit of a vignette and some grain on it just to bed it all together. And once again, this is the final result. So there we go. That's how I approach probably the most complicated visual effects shot I've done to date in my career. Hope you guys enjoyed watching the breakdown and everything and seeing how I did it. Thanks very much for watching. Consider liking, subscribing if you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.